Hello, writers, and welcome to Writing for Screens. I have thoughts. What's wrong with exploitation? My name is Glenn Gers, and I am the chief thing at Writing for Screens. I am the owner, operator, and only employee of Writing for Screens, which is a YouTube channel talking mainly about screenwriting, but going live with various writing topics Tuesday and Thursday of every week, if I can make it, at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time Zone. I come here to you. I've got some different live stream formats that I'm doing right now. A bunch of Ask Me Anythings, a bunch of these I Have Thoughts, which are sort of mulling over concepts and issues of the day. And then we've got some going behind my scripts and getting into how they were written. But the main thing that Writing for Screens has to offer is here on the channel page. If you look down, you will see a bunch of playlists. And those playlists, this is a screen grab of the first 3 playlists on my channel. I beg you to look at these because this is where the real goodies are. This is individual lessons, most of them around 10 minutes long. 10 minutes of the most condensed, pure, solid, useful things I could think of in terms of writing that I learned. I had to teach myself in a 25-year career writing for TV and movies. So on my way out of that career, I am leaving behind these videos in which I am trying to pass on to other writers things I figured out for myself that I wish I hadn't had to figure out for myself. I wish someone had made a video and said, oh, by the way, when you're working on genre or dialogue or flashbacks or whatever it is, these are some things you might use. That's all it is. There's no grand system. There's no program. There is no one right way to do anything. So therefore, all I'm giving you is some tools, some skills, some things you can try, some processes that you try and see if they work for you, because every writer has to figure out their own path. Every writer has to figure out their own way of working, what they want to work on, what they want to focus on. That is for you to figure out. No one can tell you how to do it. All they can tell you is these are some of the possibilities which works for your values, for your life, for your goals. That's it. That's the whole business of learning to write. You got to choose things for yourself and then work on those. I'm going to say some hellos. Hello, Michael. Hello, Thumper. Hello, Thendrol. And Nathan. Hello after a long time to Thendrol. Hello, excuse my back. Good to see you. Hi, Gig McFish. Glad you are here. 1 million diamonds. Yes, I am glad that you had a moment to tune in. It is lovely. Marital Atoso, another person who had to take a break but is back. Hi, everybody. It is great to see all of you. Lovely to have you here while we discuss what's wrong with exploitation. Hello, Roddy. I am going to tell you a couple of things. The first thing is to know that these I Have Thoughts, that format that I am presenting here, it's very specifically exactly what I say. Just some thoughts, some topic that I had thoughts on. It is not a how-to. It is exploring an issue, not complete, not definitive, not solving the question. It's just giving you stuff to think about that I've been thinking about. Please chime in if you have thoughts on this. You could move an hour ahead or behind. Well, I used to do an hour ahead. This is interesting. 1:30 p.m. Where are you? That it's 2:30. I thought that the hours were always the same no matter where you were. 2:30 is I'm confused. Anyway, so let's talk about exploitation. The first thing I have to say, important. This video discusses the exploitation genre of movies, not the exploitation of human beings. Hopefully you know what's wrong with exploitation in that sense. If not, we need to do some talking about your morality. But the main thing is I'm talking about exploitation as a genre of entertainment. It is a genre, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that genre. But the first thing I want to do is make clear that I am not talking politically, sociologically, economically. I am talking aesthetically. I am talking about the exploitation genre. India. Okay, well, I am terribly sorry about the time difference. That's weird. I may eventually switch up. I try to be fairly regular about these in the hope. I know I'm always losing. Wherever I go, I lose people. I gain other people. This is truth. Everything in life is a choice, and every choice has a price. I even made that into this. Everything is a choice, and every choice has a price. This is a key concept for writers. There is nothing you can do that is going to give you everything. And one of the things you have to get used to in writing is making that choice, saying, I'm going to do this thing for these reasons, but I acknowledge that I'm going to pay this price to do it. So I used to do 3 o'clock my time, which in some ways is better for me because it's like the end of the day. When I'm done, I just sort of wind down. But I knew that a lot of people were saying, it's midnight here. Could you do it a little earlier? So I was trying that for a while. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. Interesting. Hey, all. I mean, I have to assume, hi, Gene. I have to assume that Thendral knows what time it is where he is. So, oh, that's okay. All right. Hi, Donna. And hi, CG. Good to see everyone. How glad am I? It's great to see all of you. Let's get back to exploitation. I want to get into this topic and try and talk about my thoughts because I think a lot about this. Let me define for you what I think the exploitation genre is. Exploitation art is when you make an entire project in order to exploit or get the results or advantages of a single element. In other words, you're trying to if it's a horror movie and it's going to be a gory horror movie, and all you really care about is getting those scenes with that gore, and everything else you're just sort of like, I had to make this entire movie to get this gory stuff. That's it. The interesting thing is you can exploit anything. It happens to be considered sex and violence in American movie making, and I'll talk about why that happened. But the truth is, you can exploit any project as long as if you are over-focused on the manipulation of a single element of a work of art. To me, that's probably a form of exploitation art. Like they say in Gremlins, it's always midnight somewhere. That is true. Okay. Yeah. I'm going with that. I am believing what people tell me because I believe that is an important thing to do. So here's the deal. Exploitation is essentially a business plan. I mean, the point is that exploitation is somebody thinks this will sell. This will sell my tickets or subscriptions or whatever it is. And that then becomes the artistic approach. Now, what's interesting is over time that's changed, but basically exploitation is not an artistic choice. It's a business choice. It is a choice to try and find a way to sell more tickets. And that's where I think some of the problem comes in. Let me give you a very brief history of the exploitation genre in American movies. But please, I'm just gonna go really fast through this concept. So I urge you to look into it for yourself because it is a fascinating thread of the history of cinema, especially in America, and it's become incredibly influential. Weirdly, here's the deal. There is obviously a long history of this way of thinking going back to early books and silent films and theater. There were certainly people who were like, oh, if we like there was forms of theater which were very gory or sensational. Back in Shakespeare's day, there were like murder plays where you were just looking for the moment when somebody killed somebody. But I am talking, so this concept is probably ever present. However, I am talking about a very specific wave of business and product in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the United States. Do you think? Yes, absolutely, and I will get to that. I can name names on that one. Okay, so basically what happened was, as I've talked about before, when cinema started, when film history began in the first decade of the 1900s, there were absolutely no rules because nobody knew how to. I mean, they were literally making the art form up as they went along, figuring out how to use this new technology in artistic ways. In the first, this, however, became an enormous business very fast. This is very much like technology now, like the internet, in that that it was at first not taken too seriously as an art form, like video games or comics, but it was immensely popular. This art form was grassroots first. No one seriously took it as an art form for a long time, but it became an enormous business. What happened then is that the business consolidated into the studio system. A handful of large companies basically ruled the production and distribution of motion pictures from the 1920s through the 1970s. Is it wrong? Over-exploitation? I'm not sure. We should talk about that. Let's talk about that after I get done with the history, because that's an interesting concept. So basically what happened is you have the studio system. The studio system, because it was not physically easy to make, like not everyone could make a movie. You needed a lot of specific equipment and knowledge. So therefore a group of companies took over that and they owned the theaters. So they really owned the art form. What happened was because they were afraid of censorship and restriction on their business, because local governments were saying, hey, stop having all this sex and violence, or stop having interracial people on screen, or all sorts of things where there are a lot of rules. So what happened was, in order to not offend community standards, which is a whole other topic, the studios censored themselves. They ruled out, for instance, you could not show a couple in a bed. They had to have twin beds, among the many rules. You could not show a crime that was not punished. There were a lot of rules about what you could and couldn't put into a movie. And that lasted through the famous golden age, the studio age, the factory age of American movies, from the 1920s through to the 1960s. But what happened was, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, a bunch of things started to break up the studio system, broke the power of the studio system. It took a couple decades, but it did happen. One thing is they were not allowed to have a monopoly control over movie theaters, because for a long time, every movie theater was owned by a studio. Therefore, there was no such thing as independent film, because there was no place to show it. You could make a film if you could gather up the money and equipment, but then where would you show it? All the theaters were owned by the studios. So what happened was there was a antitrust, anti-monopoly court case, broke up the companies from owning theaters. That was the first thing that began to break them up. The other thing was that they were their contracts were deemed illegal because they were holding people to 7-year contracts that changed the power dynamic, because individual artists now had more specific power. They were not just owned by a theater, by a studio. And finally, television. The other forms of entertainment began to break up the monopoly on the audience. So what happened was, in the 1950s, there were a lot of things changing for the business, but the main thing that I want to talk about here is these theaters. Because once the theaters were broken out, once you could own a chain of theaters that was not owned by a studio, they had to get material for those theaters. And what they said was, the problem was that they needed to find some way to lure an audience that would compete with the enormous budgets and technical proficiency of the studios. independent film, as you know, does not have big budgets. So therefore, they were like, what can we do with little money that will get people to come to the theater when they could go see, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in Cleopatra? What they could not see in the studios was sex and violence and forbidden topics and audiences that did not look like the white bread studio machinery. So therefore, what happened was they said, wow, we can basically make the crappiest movie in the world, but if it's promising sex or violence or motorcycle gangs or psychedelic drugs or all these things that were forbidden in the studios, we can grab an audience, mostly a young audience, but that's what happened. Drive-ins, what were called grindhouses, which were theaters that only showed these lurid movies, but also any theater where they just were like, we are not studio. They needed these exploitation films. So somebody in the production end would say, we know that these theaters will buy this film if they can advertise it as having a lot of sex or as having violence that you can't see or horror, all these things that you can't see in a regular movie. Ooh, let's go to the indie theater and see that. So that is where the basic lure of exploitation came, because somebody would say, we can make basically any movie. We can have bad actors, we can have bad dialogue, we can have the crappiest production in the world, but if we are offering to show a little bit of sex or violence that we have not usually seen, we'll get people to come. Yes, it was. I didn't mention the Hays Code by its name, but yes, the Hays Code was the self-censoring rules of the studio system. Okay. I will get to you, Thendral, in a minute. So basically what happened was this secondary stream of entertainment began to build. And the thing is, it did well. The costs were very low. They weren't paying a lot for actors and sets and writers. And people wanted to see this stuff. They just did. So the thing was that they needed to keep coming up with new things that were forbidden or trendy or whatever the latest fad was. So there were waves of subgenres. There were motorcycle films. There were what were called blaxploitation, where they were trying to get the African-American audience in America to go to the theater because they were not being represented. And they were like, well, we will do these genre films for that audience. There were what called shockumentaries, where they would have either real or faked documentaries of horrifying things in other cultures and all sorts of. It's almost always comes down to sex and violence. So basically, yes, Roger Corman was one of the kings of these films. What happened was there came companies which would grind out these movies. Roger Corman famously at American International, he said, I can get people who want to work in the business, because it was very hard to work in the film business. You had to know someone in the unions to get work. If you wanted to be a director, a photographer, an editor, it didn't matter what you wanted to do. You couldn't get in unless you were in the union, and you couldn't get in the union unless someone in the union basically shepherded you in. So there were a lot of kids who were growing up on movies, wanted to make movies, but couldn't get into the business. And this sub-business said, we'll take anybody. We're not paying union wages. We're not paying you sometimes anything, but you'll get to do this thing. What happened then was that this group of people began to recognize that there was a way to exploitation, which is a group of young filmmakers who were actually inspired by art films, by European films, by Japanese films, all these different concepts, people who were trying to make much more creatively interesting films could not work in the system, but they were told by Roger Corman, for instance, hey, if you have 5 sex scenes, I really don't care what they're talking about in between them. If you have 5 violence scenes, you can have whatever fancy camera work you can arrange. We don't care as long as you are offering the things that we can put in a trailer that will shock. And furthermore, Roger Corman liked the art film stuff. And he felt like, hey, if I can find a way to financially support these young filmmakers and myself, by throwing in this exploitation stuff, let's do that. As a result, in the 1960s and 1970s, an entire generation of really fine filmmakers were trained in exploitation films. Scorsese, Coppola, Lucas, Bogdanovich, almost everyone except Spielberg. Spielberg basically went right into the theater, into the studio system by working in TV. But almost everyone else worked in exploitation at some point in order to learn the business. Thank you. I'm glad. So what's interesting about this is that it fed a generation after them. In the 1970s and 80s, there became a cult film movement. Cult film was exploitation films that people considered, and rightly so, junk, but interesting junk. Junk that was doing experimental stuff or showing characters who were not acceptable in studio films. Ways of filmmaking that were not acceptable, and all of these things were burgeoning in the exploitation business for practical reasons partly, and also for artistic reasons. These people were saying, we can't afford fancy lighting, but we can afford to do what the Italian neorealists and the French New Wave are doing with all sorts of different personal filmmaking and filmmaking style. So what happened was these exploitation films became coveted experiences that if you could find a copy of these things to study how they could use film in a different way, that became a fad. It became the cult film movement is that film students and filmmakers began to look at exploitation films and say, yes, this is embarrassingly bad dialogue sometimes, but look at how they use the camera. Or this is pretty boring camera work, but look at how they've got this character doing things that isn't allowed in a regular movie. So in the 1970s and 1980s, these cult films were often showed at either little offbeat indie theaters or at midnight screenings. There were certain movies, Rocky Horror Picture Show, and El Topo. There were a bunch of movies that would be shown every weekend at midnight when the normal people were not going out to the movies. The theater was sitting there empty, and the owner said, hey, if this bunch of lunatics and kids will come every week to watch the same movie or to see an experimental other movie that's really cheap to show anyway, why not do that? As a result, the 70s and 80s became educated in the possibilities of filmmaking, often from exploitation movies. And that created independent film. It was at the same time that VHS was releasing a lot of this stuff. There was stuff that you couldn't find, but all of a sudden, a company that was releasing videotapes said, hey, we've got these movies. They're very cheap to buy because the owners of them cannot make any other money any other way. So they would take these terrible, terrible, but fascinating movies, and they would churn out the VHS tapes. So it was suddenly became easy to see this stuff that used to be almost impossible to find. As a result, that fed what people were making in independent film, and that fed the studios. All right. Let me just say hello to Najo. Hi, Najo. Yes, the movie Deep Throat. Yes, exactly. There is a second layer of this. Absolutely. There is a second layer of this, which is porn is essentially a genre of exploitation movie. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the idea that if showing barely clad people could get you an audience in theaters. Imagine what actual sexual activity on the screen could do. Those theaters were not allowed to advertise in regular papers and things, but they didn't care, because once they set themselves up in that subgenre, they could churn out very cheap, very profitable exploitation films, which is exactly what porn was, and remains. Did Corman import Hammer films? Absolutely, I believe he did. I don't actually know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that he did. Hammer Films were a British horror film company, horror and thriller and exploitation films. Yes, Corman's filmography, many Jonathan Demme, lots and lots of interesting directors came out of the exploitation business at that era. Now, here's the thing that close off this history is that what's fascinating is essentially exploitation took over the business. If you look at what are considered major studio films now, they are basically all what exploitation used to do. The studios did not used to do horror in any serious way. They didn't do sci-fi or fantasy. They didn't do what is called broad comedy. And those are, in fact, almost the only genres that are currently being tentpole movies in the studio system. Basically, money is power. Money will steer the direction of the art form. And there was simply a lot of money in that type of movie. And once the restrictions came down on being allowed to show things, the studios took over a lot of exploitation. Action films, car racing films, the promise of violence and sex is still one of the main studio activities that the big movies are offering. The other thing that happened was that the counterculture, the going outside of the establishment, which used to be a fairly risky and disapproved of activity, got mainstream. The corporations actually began to sell themselves as, hey, we don't want you going out there. Come see us. Come see us for your revolution and your rebellion and your various unacceptable things. Okay, so hi, Ches. So there are good things about this wave of exploitation films. It was the path for young and experimental filmmakers for 30 or 40 years. And to a certain extent continues to be. In other words, if you're a young filmmaker, you're trying to break in, horror is one of the ways you can do that. Basically, the money forced the establishment culture to accept the unacceptable. Topics, styles, and audiences that were considered unacceptable became, in fact, the mainstream of the audience and the culture. That is kind of cool that the exploitation films did that. Hang on, I will get to that. It's somewhat easier than most things, but there's still a lot of competition. Okay, so let's talk. That's what American film history did with exploitation, with this concept of the unacceptable, of showing things that were not allowed to be shown. But here's the problem. The exploitation films almost invariably have a problem with everything that is not the exploited stuff. They have what they call the dull parts, the parts that you're going to skip over. And this is really where exploitation falls apart. Most exploitation films, the acting, the dialogue, the story, very often the filmmaking, is simply not cared about, neglected, gotten through as quickly as possible with as many routine, formulaic efforts to move quickly to the next bit of whatever the kick is. And this is a huge problem. This is the key problem of the exploitation mentality, which is as long as you are working exclusively toward the kick, the thing that you are trying to sell, or even if you're not doing it for commercial purposes, or if you absolutely love gore and you want to make a movie that has a lot of gore, and you basically are like, oh, fine, I'll have characters, that makes the movie suck. That's the problem with the exploitation mindset. Hang on, would Easy? Yes, Easy Rider was absolutely a bridge. And what's interesting is that Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson all came from exploitation films. They trained on exploitation films before they got to make Easy Rider. Easy Rider is basically a combination of exploitation film and art film, foreign art film. And it broke in because a bunch of people saw that it was very cheap to make and could appeal to that youth audience. And also they truly believed in that kind of hippie art film. And they made such a fortune because it did tap into something that the rest of the establishment culture was not paying attention to. It's really not a great movie in many ways. It's got amazing sequences and it's got a feeling, but honestly, once again, there's parts of it that are just boring as hell. And that's too bad because exploitation, what it does well, it can truly advance the art form. But unfortunately, it just doesn't give a shit about anything else. Exploitation is best as a trailer. That is absolutely true. The other thing that exploitation unfortunately led to was a lot of people in the exploitation business said, we are going to be working on VHS, on home video. Or now it would be streaming. But the point is, they said, we can just have people fast forward through the boring parts. So they didn't care that much about the boring parts because they knew people were going to fast forward. There's an interesting way you can look at this. Hitchcock, one of the great American filmmakers of the 20th century, had an exploitation problem in that he himself tended to focus on his visually interesting sequences. And very often there were the dull parts in between those, where people would just be talking in fairly static ways. This didn't happen always. He made an effort often to get really good writers, theater writers, novelists, to come and work on his films so that the talky parts between the interesting exploitation, the visually exciting sections, would be not bad. But the truth is, Hitchcock really suffers in some ways, and I love Hitchcock, but there's definitely these dull spots where things slow down in most of his movies. And they're noticeable. You're like, wow, that's just a TV scene. That's just people standing around talking exposition. And then they're going to get to the next interesting scene where he starts to do things with the camera. Now and then he'll make a movie that doesn't do that much of that, or he'll do it in such a stylish way, that you kind of get away with it. Rear Window, North by Northwest, Strangers on a Train. His real masterpieces, he enriched the non-exploited sections beautifully. But Hitchcock is an interesting studio version of exploitation. So let's talk about the real problem with exploitation is it's like addiction. Essentially, all else falls away, becomes uninteresting, except for the high, the kick, the thing that you went in for. If you go into a movie looking for the gore or the car chases or the sex scenes or whatever else it is, which includes the laughs or the enlightenment, there's all sorts of things you can exploit. But whatever it is, the stuff that's not that is just not cared about. And further, you need more and more extremes of that thing. And pretty soon you get essentially Fast and the Furious, which I would argue in some ways is the later films are much better than the earlier ones because they just gave up on the dialogue scenes. There just aren't any, and they don't matter. And they just expanded to more and more extremes of what they were selling in Fast and Furious movies. The first few Fast and Furious movies are unwatchable. They're just terrible. They have some nice small action scenes, but then there's these huge hunks of crappy exposition and boring filmmaking. This is where what's wrong with exploitation. I would say that actors are cattle. That's probably what I said. It can actually be what I probably... I never said, what's it? Treated like a... Yes, absolutely. Hitchcock... Hitchcock was not great with actors, especially female actors. Hitchcock's the story. William Castle, indeed. William Castle did not do Plan 9, or no, he may have released Plan 9, but he didn't make Plan 9. That was, of course, famously Ed Wood. And Ed Wood is a fascinating example of where exploitation shines. Not because Ed Wood's movies are good; they're clearly not. However, he is dealing with emotions and people who are otherwise excluded from filmmaking. And that is in itself amazing. And there is an energy to exploitation when you get a real artist working in it. And I would argue that for all of his flaws, Ed Wood was, in fact, working as a real artist. But I want to get back to, because the purpose of this is not just to have an intellectual discussion, it's to talk about when you are working as a writer, as a person who is trying to make films or write anything, beware this mindset. Beware the mindset where all you care about is the kick that you are trying to get to for yourself or deliver to the audience for whatever reason, commercial or not, in which you then don't care about the rest of the work of art. That's where exploitation damages art. And that's why I really feel like there are it's not just sex and violence and shock. You can exploit cuteness. There are massive franchises, especially on children's TV, where they are just desperately trying to trigger the cute button, or honestly, we have an expression now, something porn, food porn, house porn. In which you are basically just, the exploitation is cool shots of kitchens, cool, beautiful shots of food, discussing that, and then everything around that falls away. It's a frame of mind in which you don't care too much about the formulaicness of everything except the kick you are delivering. And I would suggest that a lot of our culture now, movies, TV, internet, influencers of all kinds, tend to fall into an exploitation frame of mind, where they're simply looking for a delivery vehicle that they don't care about to do the thing they think will get the response, or the thing that they are passionate about. And once again, I want to say this is not always purely commercial. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's purely commercial. What matters is if you are so wrapped up in exploiting a single part of your artwork, you're going to make lousy art. And that's what's wrong with exploitation. Every artist, I think, because the truth is, isn't that essentially what every artist does? Every artist is looking for something that they want to get across, or that they want to indulge in their art. I would say yes, but every artist balances exploitation with art. Every artist has something in their artwork that they absolutely love more than anything else, that they are essentially just indulging in because of their passion for it. However, artists balance that with the art form that will carry it. And essentially, they hopefully become in love enough with the art form itself that those kicks, legitimate kicks, become part of the art, energize the art, instead of simply becoming the thing that art is used to hold up. I hope that's making sense. The point is that balance means you don't tilt all one way. You don't focus only on one thing. That's the idea of artistic balancing exploitation and art. And that's really what I wanted to try and convey to you when you're thinking about what you do. If you absolutely love a certain thing in your art and you spend all your time just sort of like grudgingly putting formulaic stuff in to support it, you won't be making great art. And it will, I believe, cause your great stuff to suffer. Over the elections, you're never going to find a shortage of actors. You're never going to find a shortage of artists of any kind. Yes, you want it to be well-rounded, at least not lazy. Exactly. The movies, yeah, they are lazy. What's weird is that sometimes they're truly energetic in certain sections. And that's the disturbing thing. The disturbing thing is when there's something that's really worthwhile, but then honestly, you have to just fast forward to the next part of that, whatever it is. Absolutely, exploitation movies are art, and there are certain sections of some exploitation movies which are truly groundbreaking art. There is stuff done in exploitation movies sometimes that pushed the art forward because of the daring or provocative or powerful artwork in those sequences that they cared about. What is sad is that the rest of the film doesn't do much for the art. But absolutely, exploitation movies are art. They're flawed art, but the energy of a race car film in the racing sequences is extraordinary and taught everyone else in the industry how to do that. Examples where? Examples of what? Yes, I would be happy to. So let's talk for a second about how you can tell if you're exploiting. If you're objectifying the subject, if all you want to do is look at the gore, look at the sex, look at the beauty, look at the food porn. It doesn't matter what it is. If all you're doing is essentially feeding the object to the audience with no other meaning or story, you are probably being exploitational. If you regard your subjects, as often happens, with contempt, if you think that they're stupid or shallow, or if you consider characters just a trigger to other things, you are probably thinking exploitationally. If you are seeking to stimulate the audience, to give them a kick, if you are saying, ooh, they're going to like this chase scene or fight scene or sex scene or gore scene, only because that's what they will pay for, that is exploitational. And if you are disregarding everything except the kick, or ignoring the human reality within the kick. In other words, if you want to do sex scenes, you should think about the humanity of the sexuality, the people who are having the sex and the act itself. If you are going to do gore, you should talk about the feeling of this, the impact of it, the humanity of the violence, the violencer and the violencee. A bunch of people shooting guns at each other is meaningless without more humanity into it. And if it is only about this is what sells, that's going to make for crappy art. And that's really I want to talking about examples. Gene, you're talking about examples. I'm going to give you an example that one of my favorite stories. Martin Scorsese, when he was starting, he started out his first, he went to film school and he made some very artsy, European-influenced shorts. And then he made a very, very European influence. It was like he said, what if I made a European art film about the guys in the neighborhood that I grew up with who never have been in movies? And that's a key to it, that this exploitation concept, this low-budget indie concept was like, Scorsese lived in a neighborhood in New York full of Italian Americans who were not regarded seriously in commercial TV and movies. They were basically not represented at all. Now they are way represented. However, at the time, in the 1950s and 60s, Scorsese was saying, I have never seen a movie about the people of my neighborhood. And so he wanted to make one. The first one he made was called Who's That Knocking on My Door? And it was essentially an art film that he got shot. It was sort of an expansion of his film school work. What's interesting is he eventually got some people to put more money into it. They said, if you will throw in a sex scene. Now, there was no sex scene, so he had to have a dream scene in which the main character was with a naked woman, which they actually filmed in Europe, I believe, and it's just stuck into the movie. But that exploitation element got the film made and released. After that, Scorsese went to work for Roger Corman, adapting a book called Boxcar Bertha. It was essentially a drama, a crime drama about some people in the 1930s and the Depression in America who were in conflict with the establishment. It was at the time when that was a genre. Depression era gangsters, because of Bonnie and Clyde, had become very, very popular. And Corman was like, okay, that's a genre we can exploit. Let's make another Depression-era gang couple story. Scorsese put his heart and soul into Boxcar Bertha, and there's a lot of artistry into it. But when it was released, he knew John Cassavetes, who was an actor and independent filmmaker. Cassavetes came to see Scorsese after Boxcar Bertha, and he said, you just spent a year of your life making a piece of shit. Don't do it again. And Scorsese then made Mean Streets, which was exactly the opposite of exploitation. There certainly was some gangster stuff in there, but it was purely everything he had learned up to then poured into the best art film that he could make at the budget he could at that time. There had been enough of a breakthrough of these offbeat indie hippie art films that he could make Mean Streets. Anyway, so the point is, this is an example of someone learning their art form through the exploitation industry, and also the limits of exploitation, because Scorsese, Cassavetes was kind of mean about it, but his point was, you can't just stay in the exploitation box. You have to bring to it your artistry, and in fact that was the inspiration for a great career. So just once again, every artist balances exploitation with art. You balance the exploitation of the things in it that you truly love or feel passionate about or obsessed by or fetishize or whatever it is that you're into that you do art for, but also exploitation of things of this is what will sell. Every artist has to balance those with the needs of art. The balance simply means don't tilt all to one side or the other. It is useful to recognize what sells. It is useful to recognize what are the kicks of your artwork. So that's my take on exploitation as it regards art. And I want to just throw in now afterwards a couple of opinions, because these are just my opinions. But I actually think James Cameron, Michael earlier asked about technology, special effects as something you can exploit. And absolutely, a good deal of the studio films now are exploiting, and sometimes beautifully. Like Marvel films often are exploiting the technology and the superhero mythology, and yet creating art with it. I truly believe that a lot of those Marvel films are terrific art, but they are also formally, ritually feeling required to do certain things with certain effects and certain types of action, which does hurt, I think, the artistic quality somewhat. But James Cameron is a really interesting example because he has always been a good balance of exploitation and art. Terminator and The Abyss and Titanic are actually a beautiful balance of absolutely being calculating on how he will deliver the kicks, the extreme kicks of the technology, of the action, of the violence, masterpieces of using that, but managing to maintain the humanity of the characters and a certain interest in storytelling and the story. The story of Terminator is fabulous. Terminator 2, fabulous. Abyss, fabulous. Aliens even, great storytelling mixed with an absolutely determination to exploit the technology, the genre, and the audience. Absolutely every time. And Titanic was kind of the turning point because he did really balance pushing the technology and the special effects, but in a story that worked really nicely. It's a good story. Not the most original in the world, but solid. What's fascinating is that after that, he's just exploiting. I believe the Avatar movies are sadly devoid of anything except the most ritual attempts to tell stories, to create characters. He's so busy trying to optimize the elements that he believes are either socially worthy or technologically cool that the movies are just exploitation movies, which is fascinating for somebody who was so good for so long. RRR, yes. Now, RRR, that's absolutely. RRR is a really fine example of both indulging all out in the exploitable qualities that it is working on, and at the same time telling a story that they care about and feel is important and worthy, and trying to balance and build it. I totally agree about that. Yes, Sharon Stone, absolutely, and she was right. She was too good an actress for the way she was being treated early on in her career, and she managed to fight that. The other thing that happens is when you talk about an example, I want to talk about the example, I think, of one of the most extraordinary artistic achievements in exploitation film, which is Richard Lester's two Beatles films. Richard Lester made Hard Day's Night and Help for the Beatles. These movies were simply made to have a piece of promotional material to feed the fans of the Beatles. The record company told the Beatles, we need to get you in a movie. Elvis does movies, all these, it's a way to get the teenagers to show up and to buy more records, and to increase your brand. And there had been numerous attempts to put rock and roll stars and pop stars into some form of entertainment, and they had a very hard time doing it. What happened, and this was freaking brilliant, the Beatles admired this rather offbeat filmmaker named Richard Lester, who had made some shorts with Peter Sellers and these radio comedians called The Goons. And they said, we want him to make our movie. If we're going to do a movie. And Hard Day's Night is an extraordinary, groundbreaking work of art that was purely done as a way to get 8 or 9 Beatles songs on the screen for the screaming fans. And they included that in the work of art itself. But the filmmaking and the artistry in which Lester said, I know what I have to deliver for the exploitation product. However, I am going to do that at the absolute top of my art form. And he was an extraordinary film artist who truly, truly changed the medium. So those two films are a really great example of what happens when an artist goes to exploitation. Anyway, that's great. I'm so glad. Yeah. I'm really glad. Oh, good. I am absolutely glad that you're the super chats. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about what the advantage would be. I don't have enough viewers to feel like people are like anyone who wants to talk to me can talk to me live. And so therefore I don't feel like I need to advantage anybody and certainly not charge anybody for the advantage. But email me if you have some argument why super chats would be good. This is where you can reach me. Just go to the website, click on contact me. It'll open up an email thing. Anyway, some writers complain casting is exploitation. Not sure what you mean. You mean casting actors? I guess that's possible. Most Indian movies are exploitation movies. Yes, that's from what I understand. I do not know the Indian film industry that well, but I do know that what's interesting is you've got this machinery that's churning out, just like early Hollywood, popular entertainment with no rules. Although there becomes a formula, and from what I understand, Indian movies are often formulaic. Within that, certain artists are going to slowly but surely develop the art, their art and the art, just like video games. I want to say thank you, David. I'm glad if my tips are good for your game, because I believe that there is a video games, like film, is an art that is growing and learning. And what is happening now in video games happened in the early 1900s. And now it's happening in video games, and people are, as with movies, not taking it seriously, but that is an art form that is going to be absolutely powerful and fascinating and rich, and is already there. It's already starting, and I cannot wait to see. I hope I'm around long enough to see where it goes. Anyway, so yeah, that's what I have to say about the question of exploitation, because it's very easy to dismiss exploitation without recognizing the power of it and the value of it, both historically and also creatively, to say, what is it about the certain parts of these movies, no matter how bad they are, which are teaching me how to use that tool, how to use that language, how to use that energy, or to go in those places. I mean, when somebody does that, with Richard Lester, looking at the Beatles as human beings, not just as pop stars, and deconstructing the life of a pop star in the film, that's magnificent. When Scorsese made his movies, an exploitation movie about the guys in the neighborhood that had never had a movie made about them, there are neighborhoods yet to be discovered. There are cultures yet to be explored. And things like Reservation Dogs on television, the more the better. That's all I can say, is that the value of exploitation sometimes is getting the business and the world to accept the unacceptable, to broaden the humanity and the truth that the art form is dealing with. That's what I urge you to try and think of. Try to balance the desire to break boundaries and experience the kicks that are very valuable with the other artistic values. If you focus too far in any one, you tend to lose your quality. Yes, I absolutely do. My live streams show up every Tuesday and Thursday of every week, if I can make it, at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time Zone. I am in California, USA, and that's where I look at 1 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays and click that button and show up live. So it is, thank you for asking. It is lovely to see all of you here. I will be back on Tuesday, I believe. Let me just double check my calendar. Yeah, I'll be back Tuesday. Okay, I don't have anything going on. It's all good. I hope that between now and then you go write something. Go write something.